Yeah, okay. So, this is the title of the presentation, and this is what I will be talking about, responsible innovation paths for nanomembranes. And the subtitle is Pluralism in the Lab, and there's a question mark there, and we will see exactly why in due course. Very briefly, I want to start with an overview of the project. I know Cornelius and I talked about it in one of the staff meetings earlier last month, but I want to give a broader overview. So the people that are involved, the technology that is involved, our objective and our aims, and very briefly, without going into detail, sort of the planned work that we have before ourselves and the deliverables. And then I will want to go deeper into our theoretical and you can say philosophical starting points of the project. So I want to talk about innovation paths in a quadruple helix system, and I'll explain what that is. And then what pluralism has to do with all that. So where the philosophy of pluralism enters the scene. And I will finish as it's due at the beginning of a project, not with answers, but with questions. So I will finish with a couple of points that I want to raise regarding this idea of being a pluralist in the lab. So this is the agenda for today. Let's start with the overview of the project. Maybe even before that, and you can very briefly read through the labels that I put underneath all of the names here. The project is a so-called top-up project at NWO, and this means that a certain tenure track innovation project in the natural sciences, which is in this case Georgios, and I'll explain about it, gets a top-up project, so gets extra funding in order for that innovation studies to have the societal and the ethical and political implications of the innovation being studied. And that's the project that I will be discussing today. I don't know to what extent you're all familiar with this construction, but this is how it is. So Georgios has his tenure track at ECCM, which is electrochemical conversion and material, and then MVI, which is maatschappelijk verantwoord innoveren, so responsible innovation, comes on top of that. And one of the characteristics of this top-up project is that it's a collaboration between the alpha, beta, and the gamma, which is natural sciences, so the tenure track project, humanities, and social sciences. And the postdoc is typically someone who has, let's say, interdisciplinary inclination. Okay, so Georgios Katsoukis is assistant professor, and he is the ECCM tenure tracker, background in new functional materials and fuels, and with a special interest in artificial photosynthesis, of which we will talk a lot today. Vincent Blok, we worked together at Wageningen before this in 2 RRI projects. Associate professor, focus on philosophy of innovation, philosophy of technology, responsible innovation, and increasingly so with emerging technologies, for instance, biomimicry. Cornelius, you know everybody, so I don't have to add anything, but I'll do it for the form. So he is the bringing the expertise in the social sciences and the innovation studies, and very importantly in the sociology of technology, which we will use as input in the process. Myself, indeed, I consider myself an STS researcher with background in argumentation theory, which means that I have a special eye for those moments in innovation and science where groups or values clash with one another, and how to resolve those moments, or maybe how to not resolve those moments, which is where my background in argumentation theory helps. And we will talk about that as well, or I will talk about that in the presentation, and we will talk about afterwards in the discussion. So these are the people. Very briefly, well, actually not very briefly, I will talk now about the technology. Again, with the risk of repeating, this project, the MVE project, comes to supplement a project in the natural sciences with this social humanities, social science dimension, with the aim of achieving responsible innovation, or in our case, responsible innovation paths. So we need to talk about the technology itself, because the technology is the main character, so to speak. So what are ultra-thin nanomembranes? The main idea in a variety of fields, not just electrochemical conversion, is to have energy in the form of fuel or otherwise, to have energy from renewable sources. Now, in this process of creating these fuels, membranes are essential in the sense that they determine, and their functionality determines what is being, what kind of molecule is being produced, but also how much it costs, how much system integration you need. So these membranes are, you don't hear about them that much in the news, you know, but these membranes are that key elements in a lot of technologies that are nowadays on the market. You might have heard maybe in the recent debate about hydrogen, which has been in the news a lot, you might have heard about established technologies for doing that, which is PEM is, let's say, the industry standard at this point for creating some fuels, hydrogen mainly. And these have been, because they're fairly old, these have been locked in, and they have all kinds of problems or barriers with scaling up. So people like Georgios are looking at alternative ways of thinking about this main challenge, which is creating fuels from renewable resources. And there's, I put there in between brackets, there's a potential for disruption by these high risk, high gain new technologies. Now, one of these new technologies is, of course, you can look at other elements of the whole system, but focusing on these membranes, one of these new technologies is the ultra-thin oxide nanomembranes. I made sure this morning that Georgios will be here for the presentation in case either A, I say something stupid, or B, you have a question that I cannot answer. But I can give you the general picture of it. Normally, when you want to have an exchange of molecules, the closer you bring the reactants together, the better, in principle, all things considered. So there's less space to travel, so there's less, the mass is transferred on a smaller distance. And actually, Georgios works with the smallest possible distance, which is around 2 nanometers. But more important than the decrease in distance that the molecule needs to travel is this, and this is also what I find very interesting, is this paradigm switch. So you stop thinking in terms of how do we improve the flow of energy, you stop thinking in terms of semiconductor materials, and think in terms of precise functions which you can fine-tune because you're working at a molecular level. And as inspiration for that, right, you have this super thin nanomembrane. You can take, and Georgios does take, the natural photosynthesis process, because all of this that we're trying to achieve does happen at that level and happens extremely efficiently in the leaf, in nature. So the thylakoid membrane does everything that we want, and we can borrow a leaf from we can borrow insights from how that works in nature. Of course, this is what it is, but the question is, how do you make it so that it can be scaled up, so that it can be applied, so that it can become a simplified and efficient mode of fuel production? So I want to show you this picture, not because I will explain everything about it, but just a small anecdote. At the end of our first meeting, I was having coffee with Georgios. We were at the campus, and I asked him, "What is the best case scenario? What is that thing that you're after if everything goes your way?" And he said, "Well, in essence, it is possible that you have an element that produces fuels without any kind of huge system and huge factories around it. Something like an artificial leaf that you can put in the sun and it starts working, just as the leaf, when it comes out of the tree, also starts working." So that's what you see here in this image. That green instrument is taking sunlight, you can see it from above, and CO2, and it produces a certain fuel. I think that's methane or methanol or something. And in the right side, you have the composition of this nanomembrane. And what you see is all the reactions that happen there. So H2O, water, becomes oxygen and hydrogen. CO2 becomes CH4, etc. This is copper. If it becomes relevant, we can talk about how exactly this works and what the hurdles are. But I think more importantly is for you to feel what a huge step there is from gigantic electrolyzers that are the size of the building that I'm living in now, to these platforms and these light absorbers that work as such, so to speak. Okay, so this was what I wanted to say about the technology. Maybe we'll come back to the technological parts. Now, with regard to this is the ECCM project. With regard to this project, we formulated the following aims. I'm giving you the official formulation, not that you will understand every single aspect of it, but just to have it there set. Our objective then is to study the socio-ethical embedding of ultra-thin nanomembranes in a quadruple helix system and to create a responsible innovation path for the technology that facilitates the absorption of helix-specific values in the design process. I know not every aspect is clear from this, but this is what I will try to elucidate further. So to study the embedding of this innovation and to ensure value absorption. And we do that with 3 aims that then follow up in 3 work packages. To develop a governance framework for these responsible innovation paths that can facilitate and foster this absorption of value. To analyze, to look at the system and analyze the relationship between nanomembranes, this emerging technology, and alternative, well locked in technologies such as PEM, remember? And finally, to actually create a responsible innovation path for the technology in which helix-specific values can be absorbed into the design process. And I highlighted it because I want to talk about it in more detail in this presentation. Obviously, I won't go through every single bit, so I selected something for us today. Just to give a feel of what's going to happen, we have 4 work packages. You see the first 3 correspond to the first aims. So we want to look at it in terms of a governance framework, and we build that iteratively, going back and forth between theory and practice. Work package 2 is more system analysis. So we want to get out there in the big jungle of energy sector and figure out what the place and the trajectory of this technology is and can be. Work package 3 is coming back to the lab, so to speak, and having an ethnographic study of... I heard a sound. I don't know if anybody's wanting to say something or... So work package 3 is coming back to the lab and ensuring this value absorption. And we have a work package 4, which is a valorization work package. I think is very interesting for you. We want to make an online documentation of what we're doing. I feel that often responsible innovation projects, they do it, and they come back with the deliverables, but you don't quite know what happens in that black box of doing responsible innovation. So this video might be part of that video journal. Of course, the main output is to have a better understanding of the system and the relevant value. So to have this responsible innovation path for the technology. But we also want to publish based on this experience, and we target STS and innovation journals such as Research Policy, Science, Technology and Human Values, Social Studies of Science, Science and Public Policy, etc. And I had a meeting with Cornelia, but I was extremely sick, as you might hear from my very nasal voice still. We want to maybe look across these MVI projects, so across these top-up projects, and maybe have a University of Twente-led paper on how this works, this whole system of putting social scientists on the back of of natural scientists. This is it. This is the project, an overview of the project. If there are any questions, we can of course go back to any aspect of it. So now I want to go to the theoretical background, and I want to talk about innovation paths in quadruple helix system, because I kept saying this, quadruple helix, and then move to pluralism. So following the notion of triple helix innovation, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and later quadruple helix innovation, we look at innovation as a value creation process along 4 dimensions. And I will talk about these in detail. So societal value, political value, business value, and research value. What are these? Well, the way to characterize these is to look at the prototypical behavior that is associated with each of these values, prototypical output, the criteria which governs their just distribution, their meaning within specific sectors, within specific groups of society. So what you end up with is something like this. You don't have to read everything that is in this table, but you see, we approach the definitions of the values by characterizing these different aspects of them. So here you have the 4 helixes. I don't know if you can see when I'm selecting, but these are the 4 helixes. This is the value that corresponds to each helix. This is a rough and ready definition. So business value is direct or indirect monetary worth. Political value is the contribution to a political system, typically the idea of justice within that system. Research value, we all know it. We labor under it day in, day out. So the contribution of an act to development of an academic field and science in general. And of course, societal value, the contribution of an act. By the way, it can also be an artifact, act or artifact. The contribution of the innovation, let's say, to the protection of rights and ethical, moral values and all that. This is behavior you all recognize, so I won't spend a lot of time. Of course, how do you produce business value? You start a business, you invest, mergers and acquisitions, etc. How do you produce political value? Well, you campaign, you become a political entity. Publishing and presenting academic work, again, we are most familiar with that. What is the prototypical behavior of those seeking societal value? Well, protests, petitions, lobbying, starting and managing an NGO. And here you have prototypical outputs. I'm leaving out other aspects that we can use to describe the value, but in essence, this is what it's meant by quadruple helix system. So when you take this perspective, you can see innovation as represented as follows. This is as time goes, there's an increase in value. Generally speaking, we don't go backwards, and this is a fair assumption in economic studies, maybe not in all fields, but in general we can say, well, everything goes towards extra value. But the question is, and this is what the lines represent, the question is, how is this increase, how is this gain in value distributed? So from T0 here to T1 here, there is a clear extra area, there's more surface. But the question is, how exactly is this distributed? In order to see this more clearly, you can imagine 2 designs, right? From this point onward, there's a design decision made. For instance, a certain material is selected, or a certain construction of the artifact is selected. And then if you compare surfaces A and B, you see that there are different values that are served differently by those different designs. So in this case, A is more beneficial to political ideals, and it has more political value, but it's rather detrimental. It ends up not being that, but it's rather detrimental to market value, which means that in case A, the design is not necessarily very marketable, it's not very profitable, etc. So you start thinking in terms of, when you take this as a model, you start thinking in these terms, in terms of creation of value and dependency between values and distribution. So when you start thinking in these terms, you obviously have descriptive questions in mind, but also normative questions in mind. The challenge is to try to figure out both. So the challenge is to understand both the relationship between the values and the dynamics during value creation, but also to determine what exactly is responsible in this distribution. How is this best articulated? So just to give some examples of descriptive questions that are, let's say you encounter a lot in the field of triple and quadruple helix. So how does value creation on one side affect the other? Right? What are the dependencies? What happens when there's a conflict between the values? Maybe there's a zero-sum relationship where gain on one side cannot but translate to loss on the other. And more ethnographically, how exactly does this prototypical behavior and output, which we described in very general term in the beginning, how does this change in maybe in different cultures or at different periods of time, or maybe in different fields, or maybe with regard to different artifacts? These are descriptive questions. But of course, we're in the field of responsible research and innovation, which has a history in ethical questions and normative questions. The million-dollar question is, of course, what exactly is the responsible distribution of values, and how can you instantiate this ideal of responsibility in a specific situation? And it is with respect to this specific question, this last one, what is a responsible distribution of values, that we bring in the idea of pluralism. So now I want to talk a bit about pluralism. It will feel as if we will go away for a bit, but I promise that I will come back and explain what the relevance of all this is for our project. Very generally, pluralism is a philosophical standpoint, mostly developed in political philosophy, from which to approach normative questions in society. I listed some of the let's say founding fathers of pluralism, primarily because, well, maybe you might have heard of some of them, but already from the titles you kind of feel what type of political philosophy this is. So Max Weber's Politics as a Vocation, also the other essay, Science as a Vocation. Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty has an excerpt about pluralism at the end. Michael Walzer's Spheres of Justice. I will talk about this in more detail when we come back to the lab, so to speak. Stuart Hampshire's Justice is Conflict. So you feel that there is a move away from what is known as monist or Kantian views in political philosophy that are foundationalist. So they build up from a basic principle. The most well-known example is, of course, utilitarianism, but also Rawls's theory of justice is representative of this way of doing political philosophy, which is you take something as a starting point and then you work your way outwards towards actual policies. As it very well suits the philosophy of pluralism, there is no one official statement of pluralism. So what I decided to do is to select a couple of themes that are most telling of this philosophy, and then, have them in the bag, and then come back to the lab to see how they apply to our case. So these are the themes that I wanted to say a few words about. The number one starting point of pluralism is the idea of incommensurability of values. And this is traced back to Isaiah Berlin, but it's actually can be traced back to Max Weber. So the idea is that human values are incommensurable, meaning that there is no common measure, and they are not subject to any superior or overarching value. So each of these values is a bit like a small republic, has its own mode of organization and has its own criterion of distribution. In short, there are many ways of living the good life, and there are many ways of doing innovation well, so to speak. Now, all this comes in a context of a disenchanted world, and this is, of course, a very Weberian term, but the idea is that there's no one authority, so reason or God or whatever, or the state, but there are many ways of being rational. There are many ways of being of doing anything, organizing society or organizing innovation. So pluralists are kind of suspicious of what I said before, foundationalisms and grand narratives, and in that sense, you could say maybe that Karl Popper is also a pluralist in an epistemological sense. Now, from these two, in a way that I cannot really go into detail, follows that these republics have intrinsic values in themselves. So pluralists are kind of protective of the different types of meaning and the different types of meaningfulness that is achieved in each sector, and each helix, we would say. And because of this, they are in fact welcoming of conflict and diversity and competition, or agonism, as Chantal Mouffe would say, which is different than what you find in, for instance, John Rawls, which is, okay, we have this consensus and we start from that one, from that idea. And finally, an idea that I will want to explore in more detail later, there is this conception that justice is not one principle or the other, but justice is achieved through complex equality. I will say a lot about complex equality later. And complex equality is to be opposed to simple equality. So simple equality is when you give everybody the same amount, everybody has the same income, everybody has the same education, everybody has whatever. That's simple equality, and as a, we know that that doesn't work. Complex equality is achieved through many inequalities that cancel each other out. So nobody really dominates. And because I want to focus later on this, we'll be back to the lab in a second, I want to help you all realize that the system of complex equality from back in the days in the schoolyard. The schoolyard is the typical example of what it means to have a system of complex equality. Nobody dominates the schoolyards on all accounts. You have the cool people, you have the tall people, you have the funny ones, you have the ones that are good at basketball, you have the ones that are, etc. So the schoolyard is an example that we're all familiar with of what it means to essentially have the same status or be on the same footing without necessarily being equal. A small anecdote I remember while I was making this slide, when I was in middle school in, post-communist Romania, at one point, one parent said, we should put a kiosk, we should put a small store inside the schoolyard. And all the parents were against it. And we as children thought, these stupid parents, they just don't want us to have, chips and sodas and all that. But the reason they were opposing it is because all of a sudden you spoil this complex equality, because everybody sits in line at the store, and some people have money to buy chips every day, others don't, and you create this unified activity within recess. By the time I was in high school at the same school, the kiosk was there, so eventually the argument wasn't that persuasive. So let me maybe go back to this. This is what pluralism is, of course, in very broad strokes. And now we want to sort of go back to the lab and see what it means there. So you can imagine that in an innovation process, you have these moments when there's friction between the streams of values, let's call them, excuse me, because there is this dominance, there is overperformance on one side, which means underperformance and maybe even lack of value, so risks on the other side. So it seems that the idea of dominance, the idea of spoiled complex equality, can apply to the innovation process. And then the green part is what we would do. I don't know where my cursor is. This part, the green part, is then what you can do to ensure to reestablish this complex equality between values. This is the intervention, the responsible innovation part. But not only conceptually, we can see that it works also because innovation seems to affect value distribution. Innovation decisions affect value distribution just as... I need to turn on my light, actually, because it's becoming dark here. So innovation affects value distribution just as policy affects distribution of value within society. So for instance, if we go back to Georgios's innovation, some materials will generate more business value than societal values, or other combination of 2 or 3 or 4 values. Some decisions might lead to more publishable results, which means there's a pressure from Georgios as a researcher to go towards those issues, but they might be less optimal or less beneficial as artifacts that address matters of justice and intellectual individual liberty, so on and so forth. And the idea of risk, right? Let's say there are social risks to the technology, there are health risks to the technology, there are environmental risks, also suggests that there's this misdistribution, if you want. There's this exchanges that are taking place where benefits on one side are compensated by the detriments on the other, or the other way around. So conceptually, we seem to be in the right area, but also in terms of what happens in the lab, the decisions seem to be there as well. But also, if we go back to actually what, let's call these the facets of pluralism, they also apply to what is happening in the innovation process. Take first the incommensurability of values. There is no common measure of evaluating an innovation process. Or the other way around, we know of innovation processes that led to amazing marketable products that were risky or hazardous in other areas. We are working within a disenchanted world, meaning that there's no godlike authority to appeal cross helix to solve everything that happens in the helixes. Same with the intrinsic value of tradition. If you ask political people what Georgios should do, or if you ask businessmen what Georgios should do, they will each have their own response to the question of best design or best choices. And this is the pluralist part. They will each be right. They will each have rational arguments behind it. They will have their own backing and their own warrants. And of course, just as we talked about agonism, these designs may and often do conflict. And here I am maybe less certain, but prima facie, responsibility seems to be something like this complex equality. Being responsible seems to be very similar, if not exactly the same thing, as maintaining this equality between the values, which means that the RRI instruments that we will use, or the CTA instruments and everything, seems to be interpretable as a means to maintain this complex equality in making the decisions, right? So take, for instance, inclusion. Inclusion in itself is not the endpoint, right? Just putting people in a room from different helixes and have them talk about the technology, that's not what it boils down to. It seems to be, however, a means to make sure that there's no illicit trade-offs between values or overperformance and dominance of one values, etc., etc. There's a question mark there. I'm not sure this is the argument can be made. But of course, yeah, my cursor is disappearing. Oh, no. And now, I don't know what's happening. Oh, yeah, there you go. I'm sorry about that. My cursor just went away. But okay, so now that I made this sort of prima facie case for the fact that pluralism seems to be the underpinning of what it means to create RI paths, responsible innovation paths, the thing is, the questions just start now. Because what we want to eventually do is to zoom in this process, you know, the whole underperformance and overperformance and what it means to be responsible. And that's where the fun starts. That's where we start to asking questions about the reality. For example, what does it actually mean to be a pluralist in the lab in terms of maybe not day to day, but in terms of actual activity? What does it mean to achieve complex equality? Because okay, in political philosophy it might be specified, etc. But what does it all boil down to? And very practically, with regard to Georgios' project, what are the opportunities? What are the barriers of this whole idea of doing justice to the 4 helixes? Maybe there are more modes of being a pluralist. There's not one, code of conduct or something. You can be a pluralist in how you make decisions, in the criteria that you use, in how you anticipate or how often, and how you relate to those anticipations or those scenarios, and how you communicate, etc. Pluralism might apply differently, actually, in different phases of the innovation process. For example, you might at one point be more explorative and then be more pluralist. At one point, you'd be more focusing on specific, so boiling down to specific decisions. You might be less pluralist in those areas. And we have to reckon with the fact that the reality is that some values do dominate the innovation process, and we know this from the past, not just from studying this particular innovation process. Research happens in universities and research areas and R&D departments in businesses, so the research and business values do dominate. So how do we deal with that? Maybe that's a falsification of the whole idea that pluralism applies. So I'm inclined to, I have the thank you slides, and this was my presentation. And of course, thank you for listening and inviting me to present at the colloquium. But I'm also kind of inclined to leave it here for a bit, because these are the questions that are before us now in the process. This was my presentation. Actually, I'll end it now, and then we can go back to slides if it's necessary. So thank you very much.